It's testament to how crazy times are right now that a comment that would once generate wall-to-wall coverage for weeks on end passed with barely even a murmur. On Friday the 7th of March, the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, stood before his country's parliament to deliver a speech on rearmament. Amid promises to boost the Polish army to eye-watering manpower levels, he managed to drop in a sentence that would have been unthinkable just a couple of months ago. A single sentence that could herald one of the biggest geopolitical shifts in decades. Discussing ways to protect his homeland against the Russian threat, Tusk declared that Poland, quote, must reach for the most modern possibilities, also related to nuclear weapons and modern unconventional weapons. Bleak though the comment was, no one missed the signal Tusk had intended to send, that Warsaw might soon feel compelled to acquire nuclear weapons. The background to Tusk's literal bombshell announcement is the unprecedented churn in transatlantic relations, as President Trump's administration does to Europe's security assumptions what a star-spangled sledgehammer would do to a wheel of defenseless brie. Since joining NATO in 1999, Warsaw has seen the nuclear umbrella provided by Washington as the core pillar of its security architecture. An architecture that is geared toward defending Poland from a single threat, the aggressor in the east, known as Russia. And Warsaw has been careful to make sure America knows it is appreciated. As well as hosting 10,000 US troops, Poland buys billions of dollars of American military kit and spends more on its defense, as a percentage of GDP, than any other nation in NATO. While the US was spending a hefty 3.4% in 2024, Poland was shelling out a jaw-dropping 4.1%, all while also planning to boost it right up to 5%. Yet recent weeks have scrambled the assumption that Washington will always have Warsaw's back, especially when it comes to Poland's number one enemy. Fairly or not, the impression in Europe is that the Trump administration is sympathetic to Russia, as Politico explains this is, quote, a geopolitical shift that Warsaw regards as a potentially existential threat. Now, since you're the sort of person who willingly watches a video on war and geopolitics, you probably don't need us to recount all of the norm-busting statements from Washington these past few weeks. But for nations like Poland that spent parts of their histories under Russian occupation, a couple of moments really did cause some worry. The most notorious of these was the Oval Office blow-up between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on one side and Volodymyr Zelensky on the other. While the discourse in the US media was focused on whether Zelensky failed at diplomacy by taking Vance's bait, the vibe in European capitals was cold shock that America could publicly humiliate the leader of a country that it had been supporting. But it was what came next that generated full-blown panic. The pause in the shipment of arms for Ukraine that had already been approved by Congress will likely go down in the history books as a major turning point in US-Europe relations. Here was an indisputable signal that Washington could no longer be trusted to abide by its agreements. The unspoken question was whether Trump might one day do the same to a NATO ally. Although it happens after Tusk's speech, subsequent days only reinforced this perception. When Elon Musk boasted on X that the Ukrainian army would collapse if he turned off Starlink, Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski noted that Warsaw was paying for the service and would find another supplier if SpaceX proved unreliable. For his trouble, he was told to be quiet, small man, by Musk, and then berated by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who demanded Sikorski, quote, say thank you, because without Starlink, Ukraine would have lost this war long ago, and Russians would be on the border with Poland right now. As every European on X delighted in pointing out, the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad already borders Poland. Not that trolling Rubio made it any less disturbing that a US Secretary of State was publicly berating a close ally. All of this was likely in the back of Donald Tusk's mind when he made his nuclear comment to the Polish Sejm. But the circumstances of the Ukraine war will also have played a role. As is often pointed out, Ukraine inherited an enormous stockpile of nuclear weapons at the collapse of the Soviet Union. Although never under Kiev's operational control, the handing over of these weapons to Russia in return for security guarantees from Washington, London, and Moscow is now seen as a historic mistake. As the French Institute of International Relations wrote in a 2024 report, the Ukraine war sends the message that nuclear weapons are a necessary guarantor of national security. In this context, it always doesn't matter that Poland is undertaking what is, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive military buildups in recent history. A buildup Tusk reinforced in his speech when he declared his intent to increase the army's size to 500,000 men, to try and get every Polish male into basic military training, to create a nationwide reserve force, and to even consider withdrawing from treaties banning landmines and cluster munitions. Because Impressive or not, Poland's efforts are stymied by a basic fact that Moscow has nukes and Warsaw does not. And that alone would put Poland at a severe disadvantage in any future conflict. Given all that then, the main question becomes how Poland could acquire nukes should Washington fully abandon NATO. Now, the obvious route would be for Warsaw to develop its own deterrent, much like Britain and France has. While Poland has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it wouldn't be the first signatory to ignore its obligations and pursue the bomb. North Korea ratified the treaty and withdrew, while Iran reached the nuclear threshold without even bothering to withdraw. What could be a bigger obstacle is Poland's nuclear ability. Writing in 2024, the magazine IP Quarterly assessed that Warsaw would need an outside backer to help it acquire nukes within an acceptable timeframe. The magazine suggested the most likely candidate would be South Korea, given Warsaw's growing defense partnership with Seoul, but also pointed out that South Korea would likely suffer economic sanctions for helping out. An even bigger problem would be that Poland openly pursuing nukes would open the country up to a Russian preemptive strike. In other words, dashing for the bomb could actually make Warsaw less safe in the short term. As Donald Tusk told reporters last weekend, "Today it is clear that we would be safer if we had our own nuclear arsenal. There is no doubt about that. But in any case, the path to this would be a long one, and there would have to be consensus on the issue." So, assuming that the costs and risks associated with Poland developing its own nukes are too high, that basically leaves two options: seek warheads from either Britain or from France. Of those two, Britain is probably the least suitable, for the simple reason that the British nuclear deterrent is reliant on US-made missiles for delivery. Should Washington suddenly suspend all cooperation with London, the UK's Trident program would over time grow increasingly useless. And that leaves France, a nation that developed a completely independent nuclear weapons program under Charles de Gaulle in the late 1950s. Today, Paris has about 290 warheads at its disposal. Crucially, French President Emmanuel Macron has recently been discussing sharing them. Well, actually, sharing them might be overdoing it. What is on the table, though, is Paris potentially extending its nuclear umbrella to cover the whole of Europe. Germany's incoming Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has asked Macron to open a conversation on the matter, and Donald Tusk has said his government is, quote, talking seriously with the French about their idea of a nuclear umbrella over Europe. To be clear, there's not much about Macron's plan that's vague at this moment, but the Polish hope appears to be that France would do what the US has never done and allow some of its warheads to be stationed in Poland. In return, it seems likely that Warsaw would help pay towards the upkeep of France's deterrent, which currently costs Paris about $6.1 billion a year. Polish outlet XYZ did some quick calculations and suggested that Warsaw could offer France $0.6 billion a year to station 30 nukes on its soil. In the context of a Polish defense budget that was $35 billion in 2024 and is only set to grow, the outlet concluded that, quote, this seems to be an acceptable expense. The problem is that Paris has yet to offer such a deal. And even if it did, there's no guarantee that Macron's successors will feel honor-bound by it. As The Economist writes, even France's closest allies have private doubts as to whether successive presidents in the future will be willing to risk nuclear war to support them. From Warsaw's perspective, then, trading the American deterrent for a French one might just recreate the same problems. That, when push comes to shove, any French president might hesitate to sacrifice Paris to save Poznan. All of this might give the impression that Poland right now is in a state of damned if you do, damned if you don't regarding nukes. Either race for the bomb and risk Russian attack, or beg for shelter under a nuclear umbrella that may become more and more unreliable. Thankfully, though, things aren't quite as bleak as this would suggest. As IP Quarterly has pointed out, Poland is stockpiling such an enormous number of long-range strike weapons that they might act as a deterrent by themselves. After all, Putin's war in Ukraine has been characterized by a desire to keep the urbanites of Moscow and St. Petersburg shielded from the effects, something that would be all but impossible in the face of a barrage of long-range Polish missiles. Yet, whether the result of all of this will be Poland with a convincing deterrent or not, the key point of this story is far broader: that we may be entering an age of widespread nuclear proliferation. For much of the Cold War, the United States and Europe struck a tacit bargain. In return for Washington providing the old continent's security, European powers, with the exception of France and Britain, would agree to forswear nuclear weapons. Or, as War on the Rocks put it, European democracies focused on economic growth and trade and the well-being of their citizens enabled by US aid. In turn, these actions stimulated the US economy, creating a massive long-term marketplace for US producers. The idea was, that the more nukes there are in the world, the more likely it is that some madman will use them in some regional conflict and unleash Armageddon. Just think of Douglas MacArthur demanding to use nukes in the Korean War, or heck, just look at the bellicose rhetoric coming today from North Korea, or the occasional threats of nuclear war between India and Pakistan. For generations, the idea that proliferation is bad has been a cornerstone of not just US foreign policy, but also that of the UN. But as the threat grows of America folding up its nuclear umbrella and walking away, the chances sharply rise that countries that relied on its protection will seek their own deterrents. Countries like Poland, yeah, but also South Korea, Japan, Turkey, and perhaps even Taiwan. What that means for the future is just about anybody's guess. One theory holds that a world with more nukes will actually be safer, as it'll encourage more conflicts to be de-escalated to avoid the apocalypse. But another theory holds that the more nuclear warheads there are in the world, the greater the chances are that someone will one day push that big red button that's got kaboom written on it. Today, it may simply be the Prime Minister of Poland making oblique references to acquiring the bomb. But that one sentence Tusk spoke before the same could herald a much more uncertain tomorrow, one in which an increasing number of nations have their fingertips forever hovering over a launch button. Now, just before we get into the next story today, I do want to take a quick moment and shamelessly plug our brand new newsletter. Every Tuesday, WarFronts publishes a short newsletter getting you up to date on the most important stories happening anywhere in the world, major breaking war news, under the radar looks into conflicts you've never even heard of. Basically, if you like this Situation Room, if you like this channel, you're going to like the newsletter. We'll put a link in the description below, or you can be delightfully old-fashioned and write it down as I read it out loud. It's subscribepage.io/WarFronts Weekly. And now, over to China for our next story. So we're turning to the Indo-Pacific, where recent escalatory steps between China have rattled the island's government of Taiwan. From rhetoric to action, China appears to be intent on pushing the envelope, and all in advance of a dreaded potential invasion that may be drawing closer and closer. We'll start in the district of Xicheng in Beijing for China's largest annual political gathering, the Two Sessions. Hosted over a span of 10 days in early March, this year's Two Sessions brings together CCP notables from all over China to hear and discuss reports from various senior leaders within the Chinese government. It's not uncommon for Two Session speakers to take the occasional potshot toward Taiwan. When People's Liberation Army spokesman Wu Xiang took a jab at Taipei and its leaders, he turns more heads than usual. Quoting him here, "The more rampant Taiwan independent separatists become, the tighter the noose around their necks and the sharper the sword hanging over their heads will be. The PLA is a force of action in countering separatism and promoting reunification." The quote ends. The PLA, by the way, that refers to the Chinese military, threatens Wu toward Taiwan. "You've ridden your steed to a precipice of a cliff, but behind you lies land. If you persist in taking the wrong course, you will meet a dead end." Now, putting the flowery prose and the metaphor mixing aside, Wu was calling out what China has decried as a separatist streak among Taiwan's leadership. According to China, Taiwan is a rogue province, acting autonomously, but still under the ultimate authority of Beijing and the Chinese state. It's a popular line of attack by Beijing, and one that seems to play well at home. But there's a bit of a problem here. Taiwan's current administration, by its leaders' own insistence, doesn't endorse the idea of separatism at all. Taiwan's current president is a man called Lai Ching-te, also known as William Lai. He's held power for a bit under a year. He was the former mayor of the large city of Tainan, and he's served in the past as premier as well. Lai has been very clear since his election to the presidency that he and his administration do not seek official independence for Taiwan, and that view, in turn, is not a unique one on the island. Independence is a tricky thing where Taiwan is concerned. Certainly, it's a fully autonomous entity, but it doesn't subordinate to China in any practical sense. But it also knows full well that China can wipe it off the map. More to the point, it knows that China's open to the idea of doing just that. As a result, Taiwan has long sought to ensure that the question of its sovereignty under international law remains unanswered. Taiwanese leadership addresses the issue by pointing out that they, as the Republic of China, are functionally independent anyway and don't really have anything to gain by pursuing an official claim. China, as we've mentioned, addresses the issue by insisting that Taiwan is one of its provinces, albeit a really disobedient one. That's been the balance of power for a really long time. Taiwan takes care not to do anything that would piss China off any more than China's default level of being pissed off toward Taiwan, and China tolerates the situation while claiming at home and around the world that things really do work as China says. The problem, however, is that Taiwan's President Lai has a somewhat checkered past on the issue, and that, even by itself, grants the Chinese government just enough pretext that they've taken to framing him as a dedicated force for separatism inside Taiwan. Basically, back when Lai was the mayor of Tainan, he called himself a, quote, pragmatic worker for Taiwanese independence, and despite his concerted and consistent efforts to moderate that position ever since, China seems to have zero intention of letting it go. When Lai visited the US territory of Guam, China accused him of separatism. When Taiwan agreed to an arms sale with America, China accused Lai of separatism. As soon as Lai took office, and even before that, China accused him of separatism at just about every turn. And just to be real clear here, Lai hasn't taken any steps to pursue a legal independence claim for Taiwan. But that just doesn't really seem to matter. What the Chinese military once described in a statement as Lai's, quote, aggravated separatist addiction seems to have a life of its own well outside the inconvenient bounds of Lai's own statements and actions. So, a Chinese military spokesman taking to the podium at the two sessions and further extending the accusations of Taiwanese separatism to the island's entire leadership would be meaningful on its own. But even more important than the statement itself is the broader situation that Taiwan is now having to deal with. Provocations toward Taiwan and its allies by the Chinese military, they're nothing new. But over the span of the last month, those provocations have come more and more often, and they've been directed toward a wider range of other nations than usual. Take an incident on February the 24th, not near Taiwan, but near Vietnam, when Chinese authorities began shooting off naval munitions in Vietnam's Gulf of Tonkin in what is described as a set of drills. Those exercises lasted for 4 days, with barely any notice given to Vietnam in what appeared to be a clear act of intimidation. Days prior to those exercises, Vietnam had announced that it would use a new geographical line to demarcate the territory it claims in the South China Sea, including the Gulf of Tonkin. China, fully working toward a more stable relationship with Vietnam in the 21st century that it had enjoyed in the 20th, has taken an increasingly aggressive stance toward Vietnam recently, with its forces assaulting 10 Vietnamese fishermen in disputed waters last October. Again, this was not an act of aggression toward Taiwan directly, and it matters in a way we'll illustrate in just a moment. Before that, though, we've got to point out that Vietnam isn't the only other Pacific state dealing with rising aggression. Just days prior to China's live-fire drills near Vietnam, airliners over the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand received a surprise warning that the Chinese Navy was in the area, about to begin live-fire exercises that hadn't previously been announced. 3 Chinese warships engaged in the exercises, located not far from the Australian coast. But Australia was never notified, with word only reaching Canberra by way of alerts from the airline pilots who'd been warned directly while in the air. 3 flights had to change course because of the exercises, although luckily no one was hurt. China quite casually played the whole thing off while claiming that safety notices had gone out in advance, although that claim has not yet been supported by evidence. Technically speaking, the drills were perfectly legal under international law, as that same spokesman we mentioned before, Wu Xiang, claimed in the wake of the incident. The drills took place about 640 kilometers or 346 nautical miles off the Australian coast. That's firmly in international waters. Nevertheless, the exercises set off major consternation in Australia, where military assets had been monitoring the 3 Chinese ships, but had no inkling that they'd begin firing off weapons in a location that by nature would have had to be deliberately chosen in order to send a message. Not only was that location far too close for comfort from an Australian perspective, despite its legality under international maritime law, but it was a rare instance of Chinese ships going that far southward at all. Put simply, China and its warships had no good reason to choose that location for their exercises other than as a provocative act. Since then, China has sent numerous ships toward the Australian coast, not engaging in any other live-fire exercises, but keeping a steady presence that seems tailored to keep Australia off its rhythm. A day after the incident over the Tasman Sea, and on February the 26th, those live-fire drills made their way to Taiwan's coast. After China broadcast radio warnings that it would be running drills across an area of nearly 5,000 square kilometers, including zones that host active shipping lanes, the Chinese military kicked off a series of flights of manned and drone aircraft crossing into Taiwanese airspace, while several Chinese ships maneuvered not far from the island, albeit in international waters. According to Taiwanese sources, the Chinese military didn't actually fire weapons, but the combination of proximity and airspace violations said quite enough all on their own. That same day, the US had unfrozen nearly $1 billion of military aid to Taiwan, a move that was predictably denounced in Beijing. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Taiwan had its airspace defense zone violated nearly 350 times by Chinese aircraft during just the month of February, equating to an average of 12.5 violations per day. That's up from the roughly 200 violations a month that Taiwan has observed since President Lai was inaugurated, which is, in turn, way up from the rate of violations before he took office. Take them one by one, and any of China's recent provocative acts might be dismissed as mere showmanship, an upstart strategist in the PRC trying to impress the higher-ups, or a brazen attempt to levy an insult toward a foreign power. But take them all together, and the pattern is one of repeated international acts of intimidation directed toward much of the Indo-Pacific, but centered around Taiwan. It's for that reason, the combination of an intense rhetorical focus toward Taiwan and the choice to provoke sovereign nations that are supposed to command a bit of respect, that a growing number of experts on the region have suggested that this time it feels different. China isn't just ramping up talk of forcible reunification with Taiwan, it's even more insistent than usual about the supposed Taiwanese separatism that would provide it pretext to do just that. China is not just pushing Taiwan around or the Philippines, but a nation it's supposed to be more cordial with in Vietnam, and a well-armed, US-supported Anglophone nation in Australia. And China isn't just keeping up with the live-fire drills and airspace violations that have long been a part of its pressure campaign toward Taiwan. It's raising scope, scale, and intensity all at once in a way that seems curated for the world to take notice. Doing just that, the head of America's Indo-Pacific Command for its Space Force warns that, quote, it becomes very difficult and will become very difficult to discern an exercise from an invasion, and that is clearly by design. Make no mistake, a small handful of warships off the Taiwanese coast and a few dozen fighter jets are not enough to take the islands, at least not by themselves. But that's also not likely to be Beijing's intent. Much like other instigators on the world stage, Vladimir Putin's Russia, for example, China knows full well that by engaging in a slowly escalating series of provocations or inflammatory acts like these, it can shift the status quo in the region over time. Live-fire exercises off various sovereign coasts go from a shock to an annoyance to a new normal. And once warships firing off munitions near sovereign nations becomes a new normal, China can push its new boundary just a bit further and further and further. Hopefully, and we know this is the knock-on-wood statement of all time, China's recent actions do not indicate that Taiwan is about to be invaded, but they do indicate that China's moved up yet another rung on its long ladder of escalation. The question now is just how much further China needs to shift the status quo before the whole world will sit silently by as it readies an invasion force to strike. In Washington, D.C. at least, the year that's been thrown around for a while now is a full-scale invasion of Taiwan in 2027. And if those estimates are accurate, then world leaders had best begin asking themselves just how close China could be to its endgame. Next, we travel to Syria, where the hard work of reconstruction after the fall of Bashar al-Assad is managing to go exceedingly well and also apocalyptically badly. It just depends where you look. We'll start with both what Syria's interim leadership under former rebel commander Ahmad al-Sharaa and the leaders of the Kurdish-led autonomous region in Syria's northeast seem to agree is positive news. On Monday, March 10th, al-Sharaa and the commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the paramilitary organization that guards over the Kurdish-led Rojava administration, signed a deal to integrate the SDF into Syria's new state institutions. Under that deal, border crossings under the control of the SDF will be placed under the ultimate authority of Damascus, although local fighters may still be the ones managing checkpoint operations. Eastern Syria's many lucrative oil and gas fields, largely under SDF control, will pass into the mutual care of the Syrian government alongside the SDF. A key airport in Rojava territory will do the same, and civilian institutions there will be run under the auspices of the Central Syrian government. But the really big news came on the following day, Tuesday the 11th, when it became clear that the SDF and their allied militias had agreed to integrate militarily to the new Syrian government as well. Under the deal, the US-backed SDF will enter into a complete ceasefire with all factions not currently at war with the Syrian government, while it's also committed to hunting down remnants of the Assad regime across Syria, but more on them in a moment. Now, under the deal with Damascus, the SDF will bring tens of thousands of experienced, well-trained and well-equipped fighters to bear on Syria's behalf, while starting to share the responsibilities of managing about 10,000 detained fighters from the Islamic State, along with about 45,000 Islamic State-linked women, children, elderly and others, at a series of camps. Until now, the SDF had basically been alone in managing those detention facilities. Syria's Kurdish minority will gain official recognition as, quote, an integral part of the Syrian state and will receive the same guarantees of political representation and participation that the new Syrian government has vowed to extend to all groups within the nation. For Kurdish Rojava, the deal is a landmark moment after a decade spent fighting as a virtually independent faction during Syria's long civil war. Sublimating its military forces to Damascus has been a very difficult task for Rojava to consider, and it's been a sticking point during months of negotiations with the national government. But once news of the deal went out, it was greeted favorably by the people of the Kurdish-led enclave. The deal also offers a much-needed opportunity to the SDF to reduce its reliance on US support, particularly from America's Trump administration, after Trump basically sold Rojava out to Turkey during his prior administration after years of military partnership. These days, the SDF does work with the Americans again, and the two have jointly engaged in operations against the Islamic State as recently as last week, when multiple distinct operations went down in the Syrian desert. But the protection of the Syrian state ensures that even if US cooperation does go sideways again, Syria's Kurds won't be left out in the cold. And speaking of Turkey, the SDF's new deal with Damascus may offer a path to de-escalation with Syria's northern neighbor. Now, for anybody not familiar with the background here, suffice it to say that Turkey does not like the Kurdish elements of the Syrian Democratic Forces, considering them indistinguishable from a Kurdish group called the PKK, with whom Turkey has just entered into a ceasefire after more than 4 decades of civil violence. Turkey began an air campaign during the fall of the Assad regime that largely targeted SDF forces, and after putting that campaign on pause, it's been threatening a rapid escalation into greater violence as proxy groups under its control have made moves against SDF territory. Now, with the backing of a sovereign state and an agreement in place that would seem to address many of Turkey's concerns, there's a good chance that the SDF might be able to avoid any violence with Turkey in the future. For the government in Damascus, the deal with the SDF provides a badly needed bright spot in the midst of what has otherwise been a dismal couple of weeks for Syria's transitional leaders. Since March the 7th, a mix of apparent government security forces and government-aligned militias have carried out large-scale violence against the Alawite ethno-religious group of northwest Syria, primarily in the provinces of Latakia and Tartus. Many hundreds of Alawite civilians have been massacred during the fighting, which kicked off in response to a coordinated series of attacks by remnant factions that bear continued loyalty to Bashar al-Assad. We've covered the violence in depth in a separate episode of WarFronts released on March the 12th, so do check that out for greater insight on the situation. But for now, suffice it to say that the Alawite community, viewed in much of Syria as a stronghold of support for Syria's Alawite ex-dictator, have suffered grave consequences for their perceived loyalty to Assad at the hands of what seemed to be government and government-aligned forces acting outside their mandate. That said, it's not yet clear whether the leadership in Damascus may have played an active role in the violence, despite Ahmed al-Sharar's vows to investigate and hold accountable those who perpetrated the slaughter of civilians. As the dust has begun to settle from northwest Syria's mass bloodletting, the events that went down in that area have been increasingly described as an act of genocide. Collective punishment against the Alawite community, targeted extrajudicial killings of Alawite people, and the systematic execution, reportedly in several locations, of Alawite men and boys of fighting age. According to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, the massacres were perpetrated by Assad loyalists as well as government-aligned forces, with Assad loyalists responsible for at least 211 civilian deaths per the organization's issued figures. These are, by far, the largest massacres of Alawites since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, but they are by no means the first massacres to happen during that time, despite attempts by both the Alawite community and the Syrian transitional government to smooth over tensions. The Sharar government has been criticized for its handling of the Alawite community, including its decision not to meet with Alawite leaders prior to the most recent wave of killings, in the same way that its representatives had met with Druze, Christian, Yazidi, Kurdish, and other minority leaders across the country. Now, we should be clear, as the situation is still developing, that the information we discussed today is accurate through the start of the day on March 12th, local time in Damascus. Anything that's happened between that time and the time that this episode is released will not be accounted for here, although if the situation has developed again, rest assured we're probably working on coverage already. Now, though, As Syrians begin to pick up the pieces left behind, they face a number of evolving problems at once. Thousands of people fled from their homes during the violence, kicking off a new round of displacement in a country that suffered wave after wave of forced relocations during the civil war. Entire families that have been wiped out need to be mourned, while investigators must begin urgently to identify, track down, and deal with those who are ultimately responsible for what happens. If the party that's responsible isn't the government in Damascus, which again is by no means assured, then it'll be up to Damascus to forcefully prosecute those who took part, regardless of their prior associations to the transitional government's rebel movements. Anything less, in a moment when confidence in Damascus is rightfully shaken, will serve as ample reason for Syrians to lose faith in their government completely. After the last week's events, we certainly couldn't blame them. At the same time, Syria's defense ministry will need to shift its attention urgently toward what appears to be a rising insurgent movement. The pro-Assad forces that launched their attacks in Latakia and Tartus appear to be loyal to a very dangerous, very experienced regime-era military general who himself seems to have disappeared, but may have multiple thousands of loyalist soldiers at his disposal. Complicating the situation even further is the fact that many of these loyalists do appear to be Alawites, drawing real support from Alawite areas. Not all Alawite supported Assad, far from it, but the situation is highly complex and none of these Syrian groups are ideological monoliths. Right now, it's up to a Ministry of Defense that just massacred hundreds of Alawite civilians to show the discretion, forethought, and care required to effectively dismantle an insurgency with a strong Alawite component, but not repeat the horrific crimes against humanity of the last few weeks. It doesn't appear that this problem will resolve soon either. Assad loyalists are scattered across a wide network of cells all over the country, operating in a decentralized way and leveraging highly talented, very experienced warfighters. Don't let the rapid collapse of the Assad regime fool you. Most Syrian soldiers didn't have the will to die on Assad's behalf, but those that do, often the ones with the best combat training, the best skills in battle, and as a result, the ones that stood to gain the most from Assad's leadership. Most important of all, it appears that the massacres at Latakia and Tartus played directly into their hands. The Institute for the Study of War summed it up perfectly in a background brief on the emerging insurgency written by Brian Carter. Quote directly here. Alawite insurgent leaders designed the March 5th to 7th offensive in the coastal region to trigger sectarian violence against Alawites, which could in turn buoy support for the insurgency. The decision to immediately enter mixed neighborhoods, that's neighborhoods where Alawites and Sunni Muslims live side by side, and kill Sunnis, suggest that the insurgents sought to trigger violent government reprisals. The insurgents did not intend to overthrow the government or seize territory in this particular offensive, as indicated by their tactics. An insurgent force that sought to seize terrain or overthrow the government would have prioritized seizing key government infrastructure and defending the approaches to the city over sectarian bloodletting. The quote ends. To put that simply, Syria is dealing with an insurgency that knows how to expertly play the long game, turning Syrians against each other deliberately, setting the conditions for many of the loyalists' own community to be massacred, and government forces played right into their hands. Whether they did so on orders from the leadership in Damascus or whether they operated on their own will be very important to clarify. But the underlying reality does not change. They could be baited into it once, and probably they'd fall for it again. Beyond the carnage in the north, Syria continues to face other problems in this fragile and very tense moment. One of the nation's outstanding obstacles is to deal with Druze militias in the southern part of the country, particularly Sawada province, where many of whom have refused to lay down their arms as of now. Those militias, as well as similar organizations in the province of Daraa, just began coming into their own in 2024, organizing homegrown resistance against the Assad regime's intelligence agents and engaging in bold kidnappings of military officers to exchange for innocent people who'd been detained. Those same factions have proven hesitant to integrate to the al-Sharaa government. On the bright side, there's recently been positive movement in the form of meetings with Sawada's community leaders, but now, with the intense violence happening in the northwest, those southern groups would be well within their rights to second-guess the idea that a deal with the Syrian government would keep them safe. Perhaps it would and perhaps it would, but doubt on the part of the southern local leaders, well, that's entirely fair. Adding to the situation in the south, the Israeli government responded to the violence against Syria's Alawites by threatening a direct intervention to protect Syria's Druze population. Israel has already seized significant lands near the Golan Heights in southern Syria, as we covered in depth in last week's episode. However the government in Damascus chooses to handle this situation, it'll be able to leverage the political power and the tens of thousands of troops of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that's not nothing. If Syria is going to send any group into Latakia and Tartus with the expectation that more massacres can be avoided, then the SDF might be their best option, while other Ministry of Defense troops rotate to lock down Islamic State detention camps and perhaps do something to show the Druze community that Israeli intervention isn't needed. But even in a perfect world, Syria's got a difficult needle to thread, and we'd hope that the massacre of hundreds of civilians would make it crystal clear that Syria is incredibly far from perfect right now. And in our final story today, we turn to the southwestern province of Balochistan in Pakistan, where a massive hostage crisis concluded with large-scale loss of life on Wednesday the 12th. During the crisis, well over 400 people were held hostage on a hijacked train, trapped by gunmen and militants wearing suicide vests surrounded by the Pakistani military. The attack began on Tuesday, March the 11th, when a passenger train carrying hundreds of people was fired upon near the city of Sibi, itself not far from the capital city of Balochistan, Quetta. The train, referred to as the Jafar Express, was on its way from Quetta to the city of Peshawar in the Pakistani province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Publicly available data indicates that the train would have been moving for about 5 to 6 hours prior to being ambushed. The militants that attacked the train not only hit it with small arms and rocket fire, but blew up a portion of the railway in what appeared to be a well-timed attack to force the train to slow down and ultimately stop inside a tunnel. Trapped there, the train was taken over by what appears to be 70 to 80 militants, although numbers are hazy at the time of writing. The driver of the train died relatively quickly in the initial ambush, but the roughly 425 passengers on the train were not able to escape before the train was boarded and locked down. The Pakistani military responded rapidly to the attack, swarming the area and doing what they could to engage the militants without taking civilian lives unnecessarily. Of the roughly 425 people on board, some 214 were soldiers and other Pakistani security personnel traveling on leave. It's unknown whether any among their number were armed and could have engaged in combat. The train's rapid ambush and takeover would suggest that they weren't. It's also not clear whether there may have been militants hidden on the train prior to the attack, quite possibly wearing suicide vests in order to force compliance from the soldiers, or whether the attackers were able to successfully board and secure the train at the time of their attack. Those hostages were rounded up, while about 170 others on the train were either rescued or permitted to leave the scene. The Pakistani government's accounts conflict with others from the incident. The people who ultimately got away included women, children, the elderly, and citizens of Balochistan province. For over a day, explosions echoed from within the tunnel, while militants in the surrounding hills engaged Pakistani security forces in firefights. According to Pakistani authorities, 35 other hostages were then split off from others on the train, passed into the control of a secondary group of militants, and spirited away into the nearby mountains, location now unknown. Reports from the area on Wednesday the 12th indicated that after an attempted military advance on the train, 50 passengers were executed by separatist forces, although that statement has not yet been verified conclusively by the international press at the time of writing. Prior to that, the Pakistani government had claimed that all militants at the site had been killed, but now that appears not to have been the case. The militants had threatened, throughout the crisis, to execute all hostages remaining on the train in the event of an attack by military forces, and it appears that the execution of the 50 was related directly to that threat. Reports indicate that militants in suicide vests were scattered among the hostages throughout the crisis at proximities where a detonation of a single vest would end several hostage lives at a minimum. According to the militants' own estimates, 214 hostages were still aboard the train in advance of Wednesday the 12th's executions, and in a very grim indicator of where the Pakistani government seemed to expect this crisis to go, BBC Urdu reported that a relief train coming to support the situation was carrying no fewer than 200 coffins on board. With any hostage crisis, the first question to ask is a consistent one: what are the demands? In this case, however, it's in the demands that we find the far greater geopolitical relevance for this incident. So, before we explain what the militants asked for, it's time for a little bit of background. The people who took over the train in Balochistan were part of the Baloch Liberation Army, or BLA. They're a separatist movement active in the province that counts as its mission the independence of both the provincial lands and the ethnic Baloch people from Pakistan. The BLA and a range of other Baloch insurgent groups have been fighting the Pakistani government for decades, rallying against what is described as Pakistan's exploitation of the province's immense mineral wealth and other natural resources, as well as Pakistan's decision to ensure the Baloch people see little to no reward from the exploitation of that wealth. In recent years, growing resource exploitation deals with China have both raised the BLA's ire and raised the pace and intensity of attacks. Those attacks frequently target Chinese nationals, Indian laborers, administrators from elsewhere in Pakistan, and other people who are seen as facilitating the exploitation of the region. We've covered BLA attacks in a past episode of The Situation Room, including twice in late 2024, on September the 7th and October the 21st, so do check those out after this episode if you'd like to learn more. For now, though, suffice it to say that the BLA insurgency is highly motivated, highly capable, and has proved highly resistant to efforts by the Pakistani government to stamp them out, at least for now. So let's discuss the BLA's demands. According to the BLA itself, the organization sought the release within 48 hours of the initial train takeover of Baloch prisoners, political activists, and people who are currently classified as missing, but who the BLA believes have been taken captive by the Pakistani military. The BLA offered a prisoner exchange if Pakistan is willing to come to terms. If Pakistan refused the terms, well, let's just quote the BLA directly, shall we? If our demands are not met within the stipulated period, or if the occupying state attempts any military action during this time, all prisoners of war will be neutralized and the train will be completely destroyed. In response, Pakistani officials indicated anonymously during the crisis that the plan was to fight until the BLA insurgents are dead, while public statements by Pakistani leaders condemned the attempt to, as the nation's interior minister put it, create instability in the country through terrorism. The government of Balochistan implemented a state of emergency to help deal with the crisis. The hostage incident would ultimately resolve on the evening of Wednesday the 12th, over 24 hours after it began. Specifics of the hostage rescue operation are scarce at the time of writing, but according to the Pakistani army, 178 hostages were recovered from the train, in addition to the 168 civilians who had been released the day prior, for a total of 346 hostages recovered alive. Pakistani authorities did not immediately account for the discrepancy, but the combination of 35 hostages taken into the mountains, 50 executed by the hostage takers on Wednesday and 10 executed on Thursday, totals to 441 people, for a death toll of 60. The BLA claimed that on Tuesday, an additional 30 military and security personnel were killed in combat, although both the veracity of the BLA's claims generally and the identity of the 30 purportedly killed are as yet unknown. According to the Pakistani military, every one of the hostage takers was killed, although anonymous estimates from Pakistani officials indicate around 30 killed, leaving a fairly large discrepancy between that and the 70 to 80 people thought to have carried out the attack. The BLA claimed that its fighters killed 10 additional Pakistani soldiers during a firefight. According to Pakistani officials, the operations to liberate the hostages were conducted with extreme caution in order to avoid the detonation of explosive vests. The Pakistani government did not indicate that any of those vests detonated during the rescue. Now, we do have to pull back the curtain for just a moment in our recording process today. This episode reflects the best available information through the morning of Thursday the 13th, local time in Pakistan, but not all the details have been verified yet. Specifically, the BLA does claim that it is still holding over 100 people hostage, in direct contrast to Pakistani authorities' reports on the situation. At the time of writing, there is no evidence emerging from well-placed foreign bureaus to validate the BLA's claim, and there is evidence to support the Pakistani government's account, so provisionally, we're going to go with that. But in the event that new information does come out that supports the BLA's claim, we'll clarify that by way of an addendum either at the end of today's episode or in the comment section below. With the apparent resolution of the crisis, a closer look at the BLA's specific tactics validate what's broadly understood about the separatist movement, that their attacks, though certainly based on terror tactics, are well thought out, well coordinated, and specifically targeted. Tactically, several factors indicate that whoever planned the attack was quite competent, choosing to stop the train only after it was forced to stop in a defensible tunnel, the apparent positioning of other militants in the nearby landscape, and the ability to disappear dozens of hostages into the mountains while operations were already underway. But even more telling is the BLA's decision to release certain hostages and their choice of who precisely got to be released. The BLA's modus operandi in Pakistan has not been to launch indiscriminate attacks against those who they perceive as their own people, in the way that, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan often didn't mind taking the lives of people who shared their ethno-religious identity. Those casualties do happen during the BLA's attacks, but they aren't the focus. Instead, the BLA focuses squarely on what it considers to be occupying outsiders, Chinese investors, Indian laborers, Pakistanis from elsewhere who've come to Balochistan to be a part of the proverbial gold rush, as well. And of course, the Pakistani military. Now, aboard the train, the hostages who were forced to remain were all either military or security personnel. Not just ethnic Baloch hostages, but civilians who couldn't credibly be blamed for the problems that Balochistan faces were allowed to leave the train. And from the BLA's perspective, once they were gone, the prospect of taking drastic action against hostages, even executing them, may have been a decision they felt they could justify more easily to the Baloch population. For the BLA, those soldiers and security forces were part of the Pakistani state that they've been fighting. They were willing participants who chose to don uniforms and pick up guns in active suppression of the liberation movement that the BLA is trying to lead. We don't point out that distinction to attempt to excuse the BLA's actions. Perpetrating a terror attack, setting off a hostage crisis, and executing people, quite obviously really bad things to do. If we're going to understand the group's messaging, however, these are things that we have to account for. No matter the eventual outcome on that train, the broader situation is only likely to get worse. Crackdowns and attempts to punish the BLA will be coming. The BLA has spirited some 35 more hostages away into the countryside, and with dozens, if not over 100 people to bury, including nearly 100 members of the Pakistani military and security forces, Pakistan has every bit of justification that it could possibly need to begin a retributive escalation. The BLA has been intensifying its operations for years now, and this is their biggest single attack in a while, but it won't be the only one. The larger security crisis in Balochistan is going to get worse before it gets better. Thank you for watching.